What do the companies Apple, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft have in common? Well, quite a bit actually. So they're all tech companies, of course, and they're all highly innovative. In fact, from 2005 until 2021, these four companies have been consistently ranked at the top of Boston Consulting Group's list of the most innovative companies. They're also extremely successful. So all four of them have occupied the top spots in terms of market capitalization, with Apple leading the pack as the largest public company in the world at $2.75 trillion. But there's something else that they have in common that helps explain their success. They're all platform companies. And what I mean by a platform company is one that facilitates exchange between market participants, what we call users. So for example, Google and Facebook, both of which are platforms, facilitate transactions between advertisers, supply-side users, and consumers, demand-side users, and then take a fee of some sort for that transaction. Now, platforms have been around for a really long time and can be found almost everywhere. Your local farmer's market is an example of a platform. But platforms have taken on a new level of importance in the digital age. So think about some of the most important, most successful, and most well-known companies that you know of. They're platforms that facilitate exchange in the online environment. We can think of Apple's App Store that brings app developers and users together, or Uber's facilitation of transactions between drivers and riders, or maybe Airbnb's app that connects hosts with travelers. In fact, as of 2016, there were over 170 platform companies valued at $1 billion or more. So why are platforms so successful? Well, there are lots of reasons, of course, but much of that has to do with their core business model. So all of these companies operate with an app or with a website that allows for transaction costs to be driven way down because those supply and demand side users can find each other and transact so much more easily, which then of course leads to more fees for the platform. And equally important, the platform benefits from network effects. Part of the reason that Facebook is so popular is because everybody is on Facebook. As the platform grows, their sheer size and number of users makes them more and more popular. But there's also something called data network effects. The more users on the platform, the more data is collected on those users, which then, of course, means the platform is better able to make behavioral predictions of how to get and use more data, which then makes the platform even more effective at what it does. Now, all that is great if you're a platform company, but there's also a lot of potential harm that can come along with this business model. All of the strengths of a platform also makes it more likely that users can be potentially manipulated. And this is really at the heart of the issue and at the heart of the ethical challenges facing platform companies. So what I would like to do is to tell you a little bit more about how platforms work and the unique ethical risks that come from them, and then introduce an ethical framework developed by me and my colleagues, Abby Stemler and Josh Perry, that can help companies and regulators navigate this space. So we're not going to answer all the big questions about the ethics of platform companies in this short amount of time, but hopefully we'll introduce some new concepts and get everyone thinking about what an ethical code of the platform might look like. Okay, so we've already previewed a little bit about how platform companies operate, and I think this is generally understood by most people today, right? We know that Airbnb acts as a connector of hosts and travelers and takes a fee for doing so. And with a little bit of thought, we can also understand how lucrative that could be as more and more users join. That's why platforms are such a compelling business model, because network effects create these natural monopolies. And because the transactions are all mediated digitally, the whole operation can scale very easily, which then means more transactions without large increases in cost to the company. But what might not be so well understood is the nuances of how that mediation of users works and how much behavioral science is at play within platform companies. So when you open up an app to hail a ride or book a stay, you're probably not thinking much about the design of the app itself. But the platform company is thinking all about design all of the time. That's because everything that you see on an app or a website is designed to make your transaction as seamless and easy as possible. Every image, every button placement, every color, and every word choice, it's all under the control of the platform, and it's all designed to maximize transactions. That includes by using extremely sophisticated behavioral science in almost all aspects of the design. This is called choice architecture, or the environment in which choice is made, and it can be used to drive users' decisions, often without their conscious awareness. Platform companies have become masters at choice architecture, and I'll give you some examples in a second. But first, let's understand exactly how choice architecture works. So choice architecture comes from the understanding that we make decisions using two very different mental processes, what's known as dual system thinking. Behavioral researchers have found that we have an intuitive way of processing information, what we would call system one. Now, system one is characterized by fast and automatic decision making. It works extremely quickly through the use of associative memory, and it's often driven by emotional inputs and affect. Contrast that with system two. I like to say that system two is like system one's boring sibling. System two's mental processes are slow and thoughtful. This is the type of thinking system that you'd want to use if you had a really important decision to make and you wanted to fully reason it out. The problem is system two processes take a lot of cognitive load, which means that we can only do a few of them at a time before our brains get overworked. And so once that happens, we start offloading those decision-making tasks to system one, which is why system one is often considered the more powerful thinking system. It's powerful not because it's the best. In fact, it's often not the best means to make a decision because its speed and subconscious nature make it subject to all kinds of biases and emotion. But it is powerful because it's ubiquitous and often very hard to control. And so we have to realize that despite our best intentions, system one runs the show most of the time. This is the context in which choice architecture is created. By structuring an environment in a certain way, behavioral scientists can influence which thinking system is used, and that can greatly affect the behavior of the user. This is what makes platforms so unique. So let me give you an example, and I'm going to start this out with probably a question with an obvious answer. Would you rather pay more or less for a ride on a ride-sharing app, and how would you like to make that type of decision? Okay, obviously all users want to maximize, right? Whether it's money or time away or happiness or what have you, and they want to make the decision that's best for them. But ride-sharing companies have a different goal. They want to keep you on the app as long as possible and facilitate transactions. And they control the platform, so every decision that's made is subject to their choice architecture. So not only can they change the prices at which they can facilitate those transactions, what we would call dynamic pricing, but they can also use sophisticated behavioral science to drive those choices. So while you as a rider might want to make sure that you use a thoughtful process, right, a system two process, to decide whether the price that comes up on the app is really worth it to you, the platform may want you to use a more system one emotional decision. So how can they do this, or how might they do this? Well, one way is by creating false scarcity, by not showing you images of cars or places to stay that are available so that you'll agree to a transaction you otherwise might not have. False scarcity preys on something called loss aversion, which is driven by our system one process. Fears of being stuck in a bad neighborhood at night might also drive a system one decision. The app knows your home address, it knows your demographics, knows your current location and the time of day, and it can incorporate that data into its transaction machine. How about making a decision while you're impaired by drugs or alcohol? Most of us would say that's a bad idea. Did you know that how you type and hold the phone can indicate that you've had too much to drink, and the platform can adjust the choice architecture accordingly? And it's not just all demand-side choice architecture either. Most platform companies use gamification techniques to induce hosts to relist properties, or drivers to stay on the road, or advertisers to re-sign agreements. Gamification plays into our natural behavioral tendencies to want to avoid perceived loss, that system one response, especially when it's tied to social influences like how we're compared to others. Again, this leads to more overall transactions, more overall data that allows for even more sophisticated behavioral design by the platforms in the future. And so when you put all this together, you see the real power of platform companies. All right, so as we know from the comic books, right, with great power comes great responsibility. Because platforms control so much of the choice architecture around transaction decisions, it would seem that they should be responsible for how those decisions are made and for any potential manipulation of their users. And many have called for regulation of just this type of responsibility, including influential academics and a surprisingly large number of lawmakers from both sides of the aisle. At the same time, many suggest that users are actually better off when platforms figure out how to help us make transaction decisions. When I raise these issues with my students, they often greet it with kind of a shrug of the shoulders, right? So what if Lyft tries to get me to accept a ride? I probably wanted it anyways. And they rightly point out that some choice architecture does benefit the company, but also, of course, the user. One of the best examples is Google's nudge that asks whether you would like to respond to a 5-day-old email. In behavioral science terms, that's called a deliberation prompt. Yes, it keeps me engaged with the platform and therefore kind of a better target of advertising, but it's also really helpful and I appreciate the nudge. So how can we assess if platforms are actually manipulating users? Well, the simplest way to do that is to chart those actions on a matrix that looks at two things: the costs to users' autonomy against the beneficial ends. And by autonomy, what I'm talking about is the right of each individual to make decisions free from the undue influence of others. By beneficial ends, we just mean what's good for us and not someone else. So analyzing autonomy cost and doing a means-ends analysis are standard ways that ethicists consider whether an action might be manipulative or not. So by mapping platform actions based on these two criteria, we can quickly see which actions serve as outliers. For example, that Google email reminder probably has very little cost to users' autonomy. It's fully transparent. It takes advantage of that System 2 deliberative process, and it's beneficial to the user. So it's going to end up on that upper left quadrant of our graph. Contrast that with platforms hiding features of their app to trick users or to induce emotions of fear and loss. These actions are going to come with high autonomy costs and probably low beneficial ends because they trigger System 1 emotional decisions. These type of choice architecture would end up in our lower right quadrant and then be ripe for some type of reform. Now, in a perfect world, we could use all this understanding and snap our fingers to make the appropriate changes within companies. But that's not how things work. So despite a lot of calls for reform, there have been almost no legislative movement in this regard, and existing law doesn't offer a lot of options. So what we have proposed is an ethical code that companies can use now to assess their choices, and which lawmakers can also use to guide future legislation. Our code of the platform consists of 5 basic tenets. First, all choice architecture used on a platform should be fully transparent. Second, users should be able to make choices on the platform freely and easily. Right? Choice architecture should be limited to behavioral interventions like reminders or prompts that are least harmful to user autonomy. Third, platforms should avoid nudging users in ways that exploit those unconscious and irrational decision-making. And in fact, new behavioral science research shows that transparent choice architecture can work just as well as the more hidden variety. Fourth, platforms must recognize that the power they possess and take great care not to exploit the markets that they've been so good at creating. So this includes abusing information asymmetries between themselves and users. And finally, platforms must avoid using choice architecture that discourages users from acting in their own best interest. This last one serves as kind of a catch-all tenet, and it embodies the notion that we should only nudge for good. So as I said at the outset, we certainly didn't answer every big question about the ethics of platform companies. But I'm hopeful that what we've done is started a discussion around the ethicality of platforms in the digital age, one that can be better informed by our code of the platform.